Silver Ridge was the kind of town where everyone knew everyone. Tucked away in the heart of nowhere, it was a quiet, sleepy place. The kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night. A place where secrets didn't seem to exist, or so it seemed. But on the morning of May 13, 2004, that illusion shattered. 17-year-old Amelie Person was gone. Just gone. One day, she was a bright, cheerful teenager with her whole life ahead of her. The next, she had vanished without a trace. No goodbyes. No explanation. No clues. Amelie wasn't just another missing person. Her story wasn't just about a disappearance. It was about trust, betrayal, and a web of lies spun by someone sworn to protect the very town that now demanded answers. That someone was Moses Knapp, the sheriff of Silver Ridge. He was the man everyone turned to for safety and guidance. The man they believed would always do the right thing. What made it all the more haunting was what Amelie had been planning to do that night. The night she vanished. She was carrying a secret, one she had carefully guarded until she couldn't anymore. She was pregnant. And the man she was ready to tell? It wasn't a high school sweetheart. It wasn't a boy her own age. It was Moses Knapp, her lover, her protector, the man more than twice her age who had promised her so much, and delivered something far more sinister. For the people of Silver Ridge, the events that followed were almost too horrifying to comprehend. How could a man so trusted, so admired, be capable of such evil? How could someone like Amelie, young, full of promise, become the victim of something so tragic, so twisted? This isn't just a story about a crime. It's a story about deception, about the abuse of power, and about the devastating consequences of secrets kept hidden for far too long. What happened to Amelie that night? Why did she disappear? And how did it all lead back to the sheriff, the man with everything to lose? The answers to these questions would unravel a dark and shocking truth. A truth that had been buried beneath a badge. A truth that shook the very foundation of Silver Ridge. And a truth that no one in that small town would ever forget. Before we go into the details of the story, please note that this video contains true crime content, including themes of violence and betrayal, which some viewers may find distressing. While the events are based on a real case, some names and details have been altered to protect the privacy of those involved. This content is intended for educational and informational purposes, helping to explore the complexities of justice and human behavior. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Amelie Person was a light in a sometimes dark world. Her friends would tell you she had an energy about her, a spark that was impossible to miss. She had this way of making people feel like they mattered. When she walked into a room, it wasn't just her smile that lit up the space. It was her warmth, her kindness, her natural charisma. She was the kind of person you could laugh with for hours, the kind of person who made you believe that things were going to be okay. But behind that brightness was a girl who carried more than her fair share of pain. Her life hadn't been easy. Amelie grew up in a small, modest house with her mother, Linda Cantu, and her younger brother. Linda worked long hours at the diner in town, often pulling double shifts just to make ends meet. Amelie would joke that she practically lived on the free pancakes her mom brought home. But the truth was, life was often a struggle for the Person family. Her father had walked out when she was just 8 years old. Amelie never talked much about him, but her diary gave away pieces of the hurt she tried to hide. In one entry, she wrote, "I wish I understood why he left. Was it me? Was it something I did? Sometimes I wonder if he ever thinks about us." In many ways, Amelie had to grow up faster than most kids her age. She took care of her brother when Linda was working late. She helped with the laundry, made dinner, and tried her best to keep the peace at home. But even with the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, she never lost her sense of wonder. Amelie loved reading, especially poetry. Words were her escape, her way of dreaming about a bigger, brighter future. She had plans, big ones. She wanted to go to college, become a teacher, and one day travel to all the places she'd read about in books. Paris, Tokyo, New York City, they were all on her list. "One day," she wrote in her diary, "I'll get out of this town and I'll see the world. I'll prove to myself that I'm more than what this place thinks I am. But Amelie's dreams didn't make her immune to the struggles of being a teenager. High school wasn't always kind to her. She was smart, smarter than most, but she didn't quite fit in with any one group. She wasn't popular, though people liked her. She wasn't rebellious, though she had a streak of independence that sometimes got her into trouble. And when it came to love, she was as vulnerable as any other 17-year-old. Maybe more so. That vulnerability is where Moses Knapp came in. Moses was 36 years old, a man who had spent years building his reputation as a protector of the town. As the sheriff, he was seen as a hero, someone who had dedicated his life to keeping Silver Ridge safe. He was married, with 2 young daughters, and he carried himself with an air of authority and confidence. People trusted him, admired him, but Moses Knapp had a dark side, one he kept well hidden beneath his polished image. The relationship between Amelie and Moses started, as so many dangerous things do, innocently enough. Amelie would walk home from school most days, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her mind drifting off into thoughts of poetry or the future. Moses had noticed her one afternoon and offered her a ride. She hesitated at first, but he insisted, saying it wasn't safe for her to walk the streets alone. He said he just wanted to help. And at that moment, Amelie believed him. What began as casual conversations in his patrol car soon turned into something more. Moses started showing up outside her school, offering to drive her home regularly. First, they just talked. He asked about her life, her dreams, her frustrations. He made her feel seen, heard, in a way that no one else had. Amelie wrote in her diary, "He's so easy to talk to. He understands me in a way no one else does. I think he actually cares." But what Amelie didn't realize, what she couldn't have realized, was that Moses wasn't just a good listener. He was a manipulator. He saw her vulnerability, her need for connection, and he used it to pull her into his orbit. Over time, their conversations grew more personal. Moses would tell her about his frustrations at work, his struggles at home. He painted himself as a man trapped by responsibility, yearning for something more, something real. And Amelie, in her youthful naivety, believed every word. "I think I love him," she wrote in another diary entry. "But is this right? Can I trust him?" It was a question she would ask herself over and over again, but the answer would only become clear too late. The relationship turned physical within weeks. Moses would meet her in secluded places, always away from prying eyes. He told her it had to stay a secret, that no one would understand, that they'd try to tear them apart. And Amelie, desperate to hold on to the connection she felt with him, agreed to the secrecy. She started lying to her mom, her friends, even herself. She told herself it wasn't wrong, that what they had was special. But deep down, there was always a part of her that knew it wasn't right. By the time Amelie found out she was pregnant, the relationship had already taken a toll on her. She was more withdrawn, more secretive. Her friends noticed the change but didn't press her on it. And when she finally worked up the courage to tell Moses the news, she convinced herself that this would bring them closer together, that he would do the right thing, that he would stand by her. She had no idea that the man she had given her heart to was already planning how to make sure she, and her secret, disappeared forever. The day Amelie Person found out she was pregnant, her world shifted. For a girl who had always dreamed of a brighter future, the news brought both excitement and fear. It was a moment that would change everything, though she didn't yet know just how much. She recorded her thoughts in the worn diary that had become her closest confidant, writing in her neat, careful handwriting. "Moses will be shocked, but I know he'll do the right thing. He said he loves me." Amelie was just 17, barely stepping into adulthood, and now she was facing a reality far beyond her years. A reality that tied her life to the man who had promised her so much. In her mind, this pregnancy was a chance to solidify what she believed was their connection. A bond she thought was unbreakable. She told herself that this was the beginning of something beautiful, something real. But under the surface there was fear, and that fear began to show itself as the day she planned to tell Moses drew closer. Her best friend, Emily, was the only person Amelie confided in about the pregnancy. Emily would later recall how conflicted Amelie seemed during those conversations. She kept talking about how this was going to change everything, Emily said. She was nervous, sure, but she thought it would bring them closer together. She really believed Moses cared about her. That belief was the one thing keeping Amelie steady as she rehearsed in her mind how to break the news. She spent days going over the words, unsure how he would react but clinging to the idea that love would be enough. "It's not going to be easy, but he'll understand," she wrote in her diary. "I know he will." The night she disappeared, Amelie's nervous excitement was palpable. Emily would later describe the phone call they had just hours before. "She told me, 'Tonight's the night. I'm finally going to tell him. I told her to call me after, but she never did.'" Emily's voice would crack as she relived that memory. "I didn't think anything of it at first. I figured she'd just fallen asleep. I wish I had known." That evening, Amelie left her house with a plan. She didn't tell her mom where she was going. Linda Cantu, exhausted from her usual double shift at the diner, had fallen asleep on the couch, leaving Amelie to slip out unnoticed. It wasn't unusual for her to leave without explanation. Amelie had always been independent, but this time was different. This time she wasn't coming back. Amelie stopped at a gas station on the outskirts of town to fill up her car. It was a familiar routine for her, but it would later become one of the most haunting pieces of her story. Security footage captured her walking into the convenience store, her face a mix of determination and unease. She bought a small pack of gum and a bottle of water before returning to her car. That brief, grainy video would be the last time anyone saw Amelie Person alive. What happened after Amelie left the gas station has been pieced together through fragments of evidence, witness accounts, and chilling confessions. Investigators believe she drove directly to Moses Knapp's ranch, a secluded property just outside of Silver Ridge. The ranch, surrounded by tall grass and towering oaks, was far removed from prying eyes. It was the perfect place for Moses to meet her without raising suspicion. The perfect place for things to go horribly wrong. For Amelie, this was a moment of hope, a chance to bring her secret into the open and start a new chapter. But for Moses, it was something entirely different. When Amelie pulled into the long gravel driveway, she was met with a man whose world was on the verge of collapse. A man who had built his life on the foundation of control, appearances, and power. And now that life was threatened by a 17-year-old girl and the baby she carried. Moses Knapp wasn't just the sheriff of Silver Ridge. He was its golden boy, the town's protector, the husband and father whose picture-perfect life was the envy of many. But behind the polished badge was a man consumed by his own lies. A man who had more to lose than most people could imagine. And in that moment, when Amelie arrived at his doorstep with her heart in her hands, Moses saw her not as the girl he claimed to love, but as a threat. A ticking time bomb that could destroy everything he had worked so hard to maintain. It's impossible to know exactly how the conversation unfolded that night. There were no witnesses, no cameras to record the exchange. But what we do know is this. Amelie came to Moses with hope, and Moses met her with something far darker. She likely told him about the pregnancy, about the future she had imagined for them and the baby they would raise together. And at some point during that conversation, the man she trusted most made a decision. A decision to silence her, no matter the cost. As the hours passed, Amelie's phone went silent. Calls from Emily went unanswered. Linda woke up to find her daughter's bed empty, assuming she had gone to a friend's house. But as the morning light broke over Silver Ridge, the truth began to reveal itself piece by horrifying piece. Amelie Person was gone, and Moses Knapp was about to go to unimaginable lengths to cover his tracks. For Amelie, the night had started with hope. For Moses, it had started with fear. But by the time the sun rose, it had ended in tragedy. A tragedy that would unravel the dark secrets of the man behind the badge, and the girl who had dared to trust him. The night of May 13, 2004, passed in silence at the Person household. Linda Cantu didn't think much of Amelie not coming home. It wasn't the first time her daughter had stayed out late without notice. Amelie was responsible and Linda trusted her. So when the sun rose the next morning, Linda assumed she would hear the familiar sound of Amelie bustling around the kitchen or rummaging through her backpack. But the house remained quiet. Too quiet. By mid-morning, worry had crept into Linda's chest. She tried calling Amelie's phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Texts went unanswered. It wasn't like her daughter to go completely silent. Linda called a few of Amelie's friends, asking if anyone had seen her, but none of them had. One of those calls was to Emily, who quickly realized something was wrong. "She was supposed to call me last night," Emily told Linda. But she didn't. Panic started to set in as the hours ticked by. Linda called the sheriff's office to report her daughter missing, and when she explained that her 17-year-old daughter hadn't come home, the dispatcher promised to send someone over immediately. True to their word, a patrol car arrived within minutes. But the man who stepped out of that car was none other than Moses Knapp himself. For Moses, this moment was both an opportunity and a threat. He had built his life on control, on keeping all the moving pieces of his world tightly in place. But now one of those pieces, Amelie, had slipped, and with her disappearance, the lies he'd worked so hard to hide were beginning to unravel. Still, he put on a performance, one that only a man of his practiced authority could pull off. He wore his uniform like armor and spoke with a calm, measured voice that belied the chaos brewing inside him. "We'll do everything we can to find her," Moses assured Linda, placing a firm hand on her shoulder. "I'll personally make sure we get to the bottom of this." To the untrained eye, his words seemed genuine, even comforting. But Linda would later recall something unsettling about his demeanor that morning. "He seemed off," she said, "like he was trying too hard to seem concerned. He kept telling me not to worry, but it felt hollow." Moses claimed he hadn't seen Amelie in days. He asked Linda routine questions about her daughter's schedule, her habits, and any recent behavior that might provide clues. But Linda noticed that he seemed more focused on redirecting the conversation than truly listening. "He kept asking if she might have run away," Linda said. "But that didn't make sense. Amelie had no reason to run away." As the search began, Moses led his deputies with what appeared to be determination. But his actions raised more questions than answers. He avoided areas that Linda suggested might be worth searching. He dismissed concerns from friends and family members who claimed Amelie wouldn't just vanish without telling someone. And then there was the nervous energy that seemed to follow him wherever he went. It was subtle, but it was there. A restlessness in his movements, a crack in the composed facade he was so desperate to maintain. The breakthrough in the search came 2 days later when Amelie's car was found abandoned near the edge of town. It was parked on a desolate stretch of road surrounded by overgrown grass and towering trees. The vehicle was locked, but the scene inside told a chilling story. Amelie's purse sat on the passenger seat, untouched. Her phone, a lifeline for any teenager, was tucked into the console. And outside the car, investigators found something that sent a chill through everyone involved. A pair of muddy footprints leading away from the vehicle and into the woods. For Linda, the discovery of the car was a gut punch. This wasn't the act of a rebellious teenager running away. This was something far more sinister. "I knew in my heart that something terrible had happened to her," Linda said. "That car, it wasn't just abandoned. It was left there, deliberately." Moses, of course, was present when the car was found. He arrived on the scene with his usual air of authority. But witnesses would later say there was something unusual about his behavior that day. He kept his distance, standing off to the side while the other officers processed the scene. One deputy later remarked, "It was like he didn't want to get too close, like he was afraid of what they might find." Linda's grief was on full display as she stood by, watching officers comb through the vehicle. She clutched Amelie's diary, which she had found in her daughter's room earlier that morning. Inside, she had read the words that haunted her. "I think I love him, but is this right? Can I trust him?" Linda didn't know who Amelie was writing about, but she knew it wasn't good. And as she looked at Moses, standing stiffly a few yards away, her unease grew. "He wouldn't look me in the eye," Linda said. "Not once. He just kept staring at the car, like he was afraid it was going to give him away. The officers continued their search, expanding the perimeter and combing the woods near the car. But the deeper they looked, the more questions they uncovered. Why had the car been left here in such an isolated spot? Why were the footprints leading away from the vehicle so erratic, as though someone had been dragging their feet? And most importantly, where was Amelie? For Moses, the walls were closing in. The discovery of the car was a problem he couldn't ignore, a crack in the carefully constructed story he had been spinning since the moment Linda reported her daughter missing. He knew the questions would only get harder from here, and he knew that sooner or later someone was going to start looking at him, not as the sheriff of Silver Ridge, but as the man who might have been the last person to see Amelie alive. But even as the evidence began to mount, Moses played his role to perfection. He continued to reassure Linda, telling her they would find her daughter. He continued to lead the investigation, directing his deputies to follow leads he knew would go nowhere. And he continued to act as though he had nothing to hide. But the cracks were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came spilling out. In the days following the discovery of Amelie's abandoned car, the people of Silver Ridge began whispering among themselves. What had once been a tightly knit, trusting community now seemed wrapped in unease. And at the center of it all was Moses Knapp, the man everyone once saw as the town's protector. On the surface, Moses continued to play the role of the concerned sheriff, assuring the community that he was doing everything in his power to find Amelie. But beneath the surface, cracks in his story were beginning to form, and it wasn't long before the whispers turned into accusations. It started small, with rumors trickling through the high school. Friends of Amelie began piecing together details of her secret life. They remembered the times she had been vague about where she was going, the hushed phone calls, the way she sometimes looked over her shoulder as though afraid someone might be watching. One by one, they began to come forward, sharing what they knew with investigators. Text messages, voicemails, fragments of conversations that painted a picture of a relationship that should have never happened. Emily, Amelie's closest friend, was one of the first to speak out. Through tears, she told detectives about the night Amelie had confided in her. "She told me she was seeing someone," Emily said. "Someone older. She didn't say his name, but she said he was important, that he was someone people trusted." Investigators pressed Emily for more details, and eventually, she revealed the truth. Amelie was in a relationship with Moses Knapp. This revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation. The sheriff, whose job was to uphold the law, was now a potential suspect in the disappearance of a 17-year-old girl. Detectives immediately began digging deeper into Moses' personal life, and what they uncovered was far more troubling than anyone had anticipated. As they searched through his background, investigators found a history of questionable behavior. It wasn't just Amelie. Years earlier, Moses had been linked to another young woman, a waitress at a diner just outside of town. Her name was Megan Rivers, and she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances in 1998. Megan, like Amelie, had been involved with Moses, though the relationship was never publicly acknowledged. At the time, her disappearance was ruled a probable runaway case. But now, with Amelie missing, the similarities were impossible to ignore. "It was like déjà vu," one investigator said. The pattern was clear. He would find someone vulnerable, someone who looked up to him, and he would use that trust to manipulate them. And when things got too complicated, they disappeared. As suspicions mounted, Moses continued to deny any involvement in Amelie's disappearance. He maintained his innocence with the same calm, collected demeanor that had always served him so well. In public, he expressed his sorrow for Amelie's family, calling her disappearance a tragedy and pledging to bring her home. But behind the scenes, investigators were zeroing in on him, determined to uncover the truth. The turning point came when detectives obtained a warrant to search Moses' ranch. It was a sprawling property on the outskirts of Silver Ridge, surrounded by thick woods and miles of empty fields. From the outside, it looked like any other ranch, a quiet, peaceful retreat far from the noise of town. But inside, it held secrets that Moses had worked hard to keep buried. The search began early in the morning, with investigators combing through every inch of the property. They searched the house, the garage, and the surrounding grounds. At first, they found little more than the mundane trappings of daily life. Clothing, family photos, a collection of old sheriff's badges. But then they reached the barn. The barn was dark and musty, its wooden walls warped with age. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything out of the ordinary. There were tools hung neatly on the walls, bales of hay stacked in the corner, and the faint smell of livestock in the air. But as investigators moved through the space, something caught their attention. A dark stain on the floorboards near the back wall. The stain was small but unmistakable. It looked like blood. Forensic teams were called in to examine the stain, and the results confirmed what investigators feared. The blood matched Amelie's DNA. This discovery marked a pivotal moment in the investigation. Up until that point, Moses had been able to maintain the illusion of innocence. But the bloodstain in the barn was evidence he couldn't explain away. And yet, even in the face of this damning discovery, Moses stuck to his story. He claimed he had no idea how the blood had gotten there. He suggested it might have been planted by someone trying to frame him. He even had the audacity to suggest that Amelie herself might have been hurt elsewhere and that the barn was unrelated. But investigators weren't buying it. The blood wasn't the only thing they found in the barn. In a corner, hidden beneath a pile of old tarps, they discovered a shovel with traces of dirt and blood on its handle. Nearby, they found strands of long, dark hair tangled in the wood of a broken ladder. It was becoming increasingly clear that the barn wasn't just a place where evidence had been left behind. It was a crime scene. As the investigation into Moses intensified, his behavior grew more erratic. Colleagues who had once admired him began to notice changes in his demeanor. He seemed on edge, snapping at deputies and avoiding conversations about the case. One deputy, who had worked alongside Moses for years, later recalled, "It was like watching a different person. He used to be so composed, but now it was like he was barely holding it together." Linda Cantu, meanwhile, was grappling with the weight of the revelations. The man she had trusted to find her daughter was now the primary suspect in her disappearance. "I felt like I was living in a nightmare," Linda said. "How could he do this? How could he lie to me while pretending to care about my daughter?" With the evidence mounting and public opinion turning against him, Moses' world was collapsing. The blood in the barn, the whispers of his affair with Amelie, the resurfaced questions about Megan Rivers. It was all closing in on him. For the first time in his career, the man who had always been in control was losing his grip. And as investigators continued to dig, they knew they were only scratching the surface of Moses Knapp's double life. To everyone in Silver Ridge, Moses Knapp was the epitome of stability. He was a family man, a father of 2 young daughters, and a devoted husband to a woman who had stood by him for over a decade. His career as the town sheriff was a testament to his perceived integrity, someone who had sworn to protect and serve. But beneath the polished surface of his life was a man who had spent years carefully cultivating an image that was far from the truth. Moses thrived on control. He needed people to see him as the hero, the upstanding citizen who always did the right thing. But that illusion came at a cost. Behind the badge, he was not the man he pretended to be. His marriage, by all accounts, was fractured. Friends and coworkers would later describe it as loveless and tense, a relationship held together only by their daughters and Moses' need to maintain appearances. Even his colleagues, who had once respected him, admitted that Moses had a cold, calculating way of keeping his professional and personal lives neatly compartmentalized. When Amelie entered his life, Moses likely saw her as more than just a teenage girl. She was a release, a way to escape the pressures of his responsibilities, a chance to feel desired and powerful in a way he no longer did at home. But as their relationship deepened, it became something he hadn't anticipated, dangerous. For months, Moses had managed to keep the affair hidden, carefully ensuring that no one would suspect a thing. He met Amelie in secret, choosing locations far away from prying eyes. He told her to stay quiet, convincing her that no one would understand their connection. And Amelie, young and trusting, believed him. She believed his words when he told her he loved her, when he promised they would find a way to be together, even as his actions told a different story. For Moses, the affair was a game of risk and reward. But when Amelie told him she was pregnant, everything changed. The pregnancy was a ticking time bomb. It wasn't just a threat to Moses' marriage. It was a threat to his entire life. His career, his reputation, his carefully constructed image as the town sheriff. All of it could be undone by one word from Amelie. And for a man like Moses, whose power and control defined him, the idea of losing it all was unbearable. Psychologists who later analyzed the case described Moses as a textbook example of someone who used manipulation and control to maintain his sense of self-worth. Dr. Karen Howard, a criminal psychologist familiar with the case, explained, "For men like Moses, everything revolves around their image. He wasn't just protecting his secrets. He was protecting the version of himself he wanted the world to see." Amelie's pregnancy wasn't just inconvenient. It was catastrophic. And in his mind, the only way to protect his perfect image was to eliminate the problem. To Moses, Amelie wasn't a person anymore. She wasn't the 17-year-old girl who had fallen in love with him, or the aspiring teacher who wrote poetry and dreamed of a better life. She was a threat, a loose end that needed to be tied up. And for a man who had spent years controlling every aspect of his life, tying up that loose end likely felt like his only option. But what drove Moses to cross the ultimate line? What made him go from manipulation to murder? According to experts, it wasn't just fear, it was betrayal. Amelie, in her innocence, had believed Moses would stand by her when she revealed the pregnancy. She thought he would rise to the occasion and prove his love for her. But in Moses' eyes, her decision to tell him was a betrayal of the very rules he had set. She was breaking the silence, threatening the control he had so carefully maintained. And for someone like Moses, that kind of defiance wasn't just unacceptable, it was unforgivable. Dr. Howard elaborated. Moses likely viewed Amelie's pregnancy as a betrayal of their unspoken agreement to keep things quiet. She forced him to confront the possibility of losing everything he valued. His job, his family, his reputation. And for someone with his mindset, the idea of losing control was more terrifying than anything else. That fear drove him to silence her permanently. But Moses didn't act out of passion or impulse. Everything he did was calculated. From the moment Amelie told him she was pregnant, he began laying the groundwork for her disappearance. He chose the barn as the location for their meeting, knowing it was secluded and far from any witnesses. He likely rehearsed what he would say, how he would try to calm her down, maybe even convince her not to go public with the pregnancy. But when it became clear that Amelie wasn't going to back down, Moses made his decision. And it was in that moment that Moses showed his true self. Not the devoted sheriff, not the loving husband, but the cold, selfish man who was willing to destroy a life to protect his own. The tragedy of this story isn't just what happened to Amelie. It's the betrayal at its core. The betrayal of a young girl who trusted someone she believed cared for her. The betrayal of a community that placed its faith in a man who swore to uphold the law. And the ultimate betrayal of the badge that Moses wore every day. A badge that was supposed to stand for justice but became a shield for his lies. For Moses, the pregnancy wasn't just an inconvenience. It was the truth that could tear down the house of cards he had built. And in his mind, protecting that house of cards was worth more than the life of a 17-year-old girl who had loved him, trusted him, and believed his promises. The walls finally came crashing down on Moses Knapp in December of 2004, 7 months after Amelie Person disappeared. For weeks, investigators had carefully built their case against him. They gathered evidence, listened to testimonies, and unraveled the lies he had so carefully constructed. And though Amelie's body had never been found, there was enough to paint a damning picture of guilt. On December 3rd, the man who once wore a badge as a symbol of trust and safety was led away in handcuffs from his own office, arrested for the murder of the 17-year-old girl who had trusted him most. The news of Moses' arrest sent shockwaves through Silver Ridge. People who had once respected him, who had called him a hero, now struggled to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the monster the evidence suggested he was. His mugshot, plastered across local news stations, became a symbol of betrayal for a town grappling with the unthinkable. A sheriff, accused of murder. A protector, revealed to be a predator. The prosecution's case was built on a combination of forensic evidence, testimonies, and circumstantial proof that painted a grim and undeniable narrative. At the heart of the case was the bloodstain found in Moses' barn. Forensic experts testified that the blood matched Amelie's DNA with near certainty. The defense tried to argue that the blood could have been transferred there innocently, perhaps from a minor injury during one of Amelie's visits to the ranch. But the prosecutors countered with the chilling detail that the amount of blood suggested a violent struggle, far more than could be explained by an innocent accident. Amelie's friends also took the stand, offering heart-wrenching accounts of her secret relationship with Moses. Text messages and voicemails were presented as evidence, revealing a pattern of manipulation and control. One voicemail, in particular, brought the courtroom to a standstill. It was a message Amelie had saved just weeks before her disappearance. In it, Moses' voice could be heard, calm but insistent. "We need to be careful, Amelie. No one can know about this. You understand, don't you?" The subtext was clear. Moses had always been more concerned with protecting himself than with Amelie's well-being. But it was the testimony of Moses' wife, Sharon Knapp, that delivered one of the most damning blows to the defense. Sharon, who had remained silent for months, finally broke her silence during the trial. In a shaky voice, she described overhearing a phone call between Moses and someone she now believed to be Amelie on the night of her disappearance. "He was in the barn," Sharon testified. "I heard him say, 'You need to calm down. This is getting out of hand.' He sounded angry, and then the call just ended." Sharon's testimony was devastating, not just for the prosecution but for the image Moses had tried so desperately to protect. The illusion of a perfect family man, already in shambles, was obliterated. Sharon's words painted a picture of a man who wasn't just guilty but calculating. A man who had orchestrated every move to cover his tracks, even as his wife and children slept just yards away. The defense scrambled to poke holes in the prosecution's case, but their efforts fell flat. They argued that without a body, there was no definitive proof that Amelie was dead. They suggested that the bloodstain could have been planted, that the testimonies from Amelie's friends were based on speculation, and that Moses was being unfairly targeted because of his position of power. But the jury, made up of 10 women and 2 men, wasn't convinced. The trial lasted 6 weeks, but the jury deliberated for less than a day. On February 10, 2005, Moses Knapp was found guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, except for the muffled sobs of Linda Cantu, who clutched a photo of her daughter in her trembling hands. Moses, who had remained stoic throughout the trial, showed no visible reaction. He simply stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. For him, it was over. The mask he had worn for so long had been torn away, and the man underneath was exposed for the entire world to see. At his sentencing, Linda Cantu addressed the court, her voice strong despite the grief that threatened to overwhelm her. "You took my baby from me," she said, her eyes locked on Moses. "You took her future, her dreams, her laughter. And for what? To protect your lies? I hope you remember her face every day for the rest of your life. I hope it haunts you." Her words echoed through the courtroom, a mother's pain laid bare for all to see. Moses was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge, in his final remarks, described the crime as a heinous act of betrayal from a man who was supposed to uphold the law. The aftermath of the trial left Silver Ridge forever changed. The community, once built on trust and familiarity, now felt fractured. People questioned how they could have been so blind to the truth, how a man like Moses could have fooled them all for so long. And though justice had been served in the eyes of the law, there was one question that remained unanswered. Where was Amelie? For Linda, the conviction brought a measure of closure, but it wasn't enough. "I won't stop looking for her," she said in an interview shortly after the trial. "I need to bring her home. She deserves that." And so, even as Moses Knapp sat behind bars, serving his sentence for the murder of a girl whose body had never been found, the search for Amelie continued. For her family, for her friends, and for the town of Silver Ridge, her absence remained a wound that time would never fully heal.